Hello everyone. In this breakdown I would like to show you how I made this sailboat using Trimsheets. So first of all, I liked this design of the boat. It is by Joshua J. Christie, and it looks like something from World of Warcraft or something. He has a very unique style in his design. So I wanted to make this into a 3D object and practice my skills in. So I gathered more references to understand how boats work, how sailboats work. This is a fishing boat, and I wanted to see how they function exactly. Some of them have very detailed uh, looks and explanations of things that I can't even read, but I wanted to see the anatomy of these boats so I can put them together. This is different views and cross sections of the boat. These are close-ups of the pulley. Here's the style I wanted to go for, and I wanted to go for something like World of Warcraft, like this one here. And I wanted the boat to be painted. I wanted a lot of painting, hand painting, textures, and things like that. So it looks really nice. So I don't have to make it too realistic. This is the style of the barrels. These are more references of the lights. I actually really like this style. I ended up using some of the elements for the lights and the curvature maps. And I also gathered some trim sheets because I wanted to make trim sheets for the boat. And here's some more pictures from World of Warcraft. See, they use gradient maps and they mix two different textures. And this is the tuna fish I added later on to give it a story element. After I gathered these references, I went and highlighted and color coded the different elements of the boats so I know which part can share with other parts and where can I reuse some elements, like where can I reuse textures or objects. Like this is purple because I can reuse this here and then um, paint it differently. And yeah, all these ropes, and this helps me understand and analyze the boat. And then I try to name which of the objects I wanted to be unique and which of them are going to use the trim sheets. I try to pay attention to the textures. These textures of the wood are different looking from these textures, so I need to pay attention to how many different types of wood I should use in my trim sheets. In the first stage, we block out the model. So we start with the ship and design very basic look of the ship to see how it looks and how big it is. And I usually like to bring a character from Unreal Engine, the mannequin, to compare it to the sizes of the objects here. And I also have to stick to the references, so you can see some of the parts might be a little too big for the character to use, but I want it to be as close as the reference as the original design as possible. So in this stage we wanted to keep everything simple, no details or anything else. After the block out, I started refining the object even more. So the box became a lamp and I added bevels and more details because see, I didn't even apply the modifier. Um, and the boat itself um, is more detailed, has bevels all over the edges. And bevels are very important to make the object look very good in detail. Even though it's a low poly game object, is designed to be viewed from about this angle. It's not designed for first person or third person. It's just designed to be looked from afar. So I didn't need to add very high details because there I will not be getting too close to it. So I added ropes, I used the splines, and I added knots in each of those splines, as you can see. And I copied and pasted and tweaked a little bit the splines. I refined the shapes of um, these, for example, the chains here. The chain, I used a modifier, actually a plugin for the chain, and it allowed me to use a spline and then convert it to a chain. And then I added more details to other objects. This is how I made the trim sheets. So I went like this and separated each of these and then went like this and extruded it. And then like from the edges, I didn't need this. So, and then I took this part and then did like this. And then I added a little bevel like this. And then I did the other parts like this, for example, for the wood planks. I made it like this and, you know, different shapes of wood. Each one is separate from one another right here. I ended up with this. So now I have the metal and a little smaller wooden planks and the smoother ones. And there's a space here for tileable texture for the metal and another space for the wood textures because the wood textures have three different textures. And then these 4 cylinders for the wood cuttings. And this is how I made, I took it to ZBrush from here. I also had to subdivide it, the the planks. So originally it's like without square, these smaller faces is just one connected shape, but I had to segment it into smaller faces because ZBrush, when you subdivide it in ZBrush, it adds more even subdivisions, so you can sculpt it easier. I hope that makes sense. When I did this, I had in mind that the size of the trim sheet is going to be about this size, the size of this paper, 1 meter by 1 meter. So I added a little bit extra on the sides just because I wanted them to tile from right to left. As you can see in ZBrush, when I sculpted this part, I made sure it tiles right here. So the brush would tile from here to here. So it wraps over to the other end. And then I took it to ZBrush and then I started sculpting each of these shapes to make them look like wood, like wooden planks that the ship would have. And I wanted something more extreme and rough and defined with bigger shapes and another smoother type for other parts of the ship. And this red part over on the top is the metal part, so I made sure it's just it has bumpings like in the hammer, like it was hammered, and then some scratches. After exporting the low poly as a piece, a plane, a squared plane, and a high poly from ZBrush, imported them to Blender and then made sure they're close together and then exported the low poly plane as a low poly, then imported this to Substance Painter, and then I went to baking settings and then imported the high poly model and then baked it on top of the plane, and this is the result I got, which is a very good starting point for me to add all the details and start coloring these separate shapes. Also, I had a color ID, which allows me to easily mask each of these individual objects and then paint them with different colors. And this is how I mask them. I put a color selection, for the example, the wood patterns. This is the top right part. I masked it out and then I proceeded to add details inside of it, like all these different looking waves in the wood to um, give it a nice, interesting look. I didn't copy the same exact reference. I wanted to add some interesting shapes from my own imagination. So I made the metal look like this. This is the metal trim, and this is the colors of the wood cuttings. And I made one for the rope, and I added curvature map, which highlights the edges of the metal, which looks really nice with the details of the sculpted details. And this is amazing because it's all a piece of plane, but from here, with the lights reflecting on it, it looks like an object. This is a very nice effect. I also added curvature maps, which highlights the edges of the wood, and an ambient occlusion color on these. Let me show you the base color. As you can see, the base color itself, I used base color for the shadows in the occluded areas and to give it a very nice shape. As for the other unique assets, I decided they won't use the trim sheets. I exported them after UV unwrapping and then proceeded to paint each of these individual assets. And I ended up with a sheet like this. As you can see, it's not a trim sheet. After importing the trim sheet to Blender, I proceeded to mapping each object to the trim sheet that I wanted it to use it. So for example, this wood, or let's start with this wood cap. It's mapped, the top part is simply unwrapped and is mapped on top of this. And it's just as simple as that. And with the other edges, you can see as I click them, they are mapped in a straight shape. When I unwrap them, I made sure they are straight, so they follow the same exact curvature. They give me the curvature of the edges of the metal because I wanted to capture the edges. As you can see, it wraps very neatly all the way around. There's no seams, nothing else. And for the wood, it's more tricky because I had to segment each of them, these parts. You can see one segment, and then I map it on top of this. And you can see if I did this and then expand it, you can see this is one trim, and this is another one, and this is another one. Each of these are mapped to different wood plank elsewhere. See, this one's here, this one's there. Same for this one. This one is more complicated shape. So I took this part, made it to a square shape. This part is the same. It's same. So you can see each of these faces are mapped to a different object. And this is how the ship was designed. It's very similar. as you can see. Let me show you the whole shape first. Let me hide this part. As you can see, I took this part and I mapped it here. Same here. See how many seams I have? A lot of seams. But this is how I use the trim sheet. Basically, design the trim sheet first, and then after this, you map each of the object or the faces of the object you want into the trim sheet. So this one is also mapped to these, the wood cuttings. The same wood cuttings are used on top here. And as for the rope, it's also mapped right here in a straight line. And that's how I did the trim sheet. As for the swordfish, I took a picture from Google of a tuna fish, and then I basically went like this, put a plane behind, and went like this, and started designing and copying the same shape of the fish. And all I had to do is um, mirror this to the other side and then unwrap it, and then took it to Substance Painter, where I proceeded to add the colors. So I used the stencil, and I brought the same fish reference, and I painted the black and white of the colors. I didn't want exactly the same realistic colors. I wanted it to be a little bit stylized. So I used the real image for reference, and then I added color on top to the blue, the top part with a brush, and then I added the lines, the ink, and that's how I got the final shape of the. For the lighting, I started with an ambient light. Then I increased the emission on certain parts where I wanted it to be more highlighted, like the fish. The parts where I wanted the lights to be more translucent, so I added some emission. This is a very common cheap technique to fake subsurface scattering. And of course the lamp itself. Then I added a spotlight on the front, and then a fill light from the bottom, and finally the main light. And this is what we get in the end.